This is a thermostat. It's mounted on the wall of an apartment building in Warsaw, Poland, set to 21 degrees Celsius, room temperature, the baseline of modern comfort that Europeans have taken for granted since central heating became universal. The digital display shows the current temperature, 21.0. The number seems stable, permanent, as fixed as the wall it's mounted on. But that number depends on a supply chain that stretches 4,000 kilometers east, passes through infrastructure that no longer fully functions, and relies on storage reserves that are draining faster than they're being refilled. On January 24, 2026, that supply chain has exactly 31 days of buffer remaining before the mathematics become impossible, before the gas that heats this apartment and 140 million others across Europe simply isn't there anymore. The temperature on that thermostat is about to start dropping, and there is nothing, no emergency measure, no diplomatic intervention, no market mechanism that can stop it within the timeline that matters. At 6 a.m. Moscow time on January 22, 2026, Gazprom issued a force majeure declaration on all remaining European supply contracts, citing technical impossibility of delivery through available infrastructure and non-resolution of payment disputes affecting upstream operations. The declaration was 3 paragraphs long. It terminated gas flows through the last operational pipeline corridor, Turkstream's European branch, effective immediately. This is not a negotiating tactic. This is not a temporary disruption. This is the final severance of a supply relationship that has defined European energy security for 50 years. Here's what they're not telling you. European gas storage entered January 2026 at 68% capacity, below the 90% mandate established after the 2022 crisis, but supposedly adequate for a normal winter. The problem is that this winter stopped being normal on January 8th, when a polar vortex destabilization pushed Arctic air masses across the continent in a pattern meteorologists are calling a once-in-generation cold event. Temperatures across Central and Northern Europe have averaged 6 to 8 degrees Celsius below normal since January 10th. Germany recorded its coldest January week since 1987. Poland recorded its coldest since 1979. The Baltic states have experienced temperatures below minus 25 Celsius for 12 consecutive days. Cold weather increases gas demand through a multiplier effect. Every degree below normal increases heating demand by approximately 3 to 4%. 8 degrees below normal means 24 to 32% higher demand. Applied across the European consumption base of 400 billion cubic meters annually, the cold snap has added approximately 80 to 100 million cubic meters of daily demand above planning assumptions. Storage that was supposed to last through March is now projected to hit critical levels by late February. At current withdrawal rates, European aggregate storage will fall below 20% by February 25th, the threshold at which physical supply constraints begin forcing curtailments regardless of price or policy. At 11:45 p.m. Brussels time on January 23rd, the European network of transmission system operators upgraded the system status from yellow to orange, indicating that coordinated intervention is now required to prevent supply failures. The upgrade was announced in a technical bulletin distributed to member operators. No press release was issued. The public-facing communications continue to describe the situation as challenging but manageable. The gap between what officials say and what operators know has never been wider. This is where the lie becomes unsustainable. The force majeure declaration was legally structured to maximize damage while minimizing Russian liability. Under the remaining Turkstream contracts, Gazprom was obligated to deliver approximately 15 billion cubic meters annually to European buyers, Hungary, Serbia, and several Austrian and Italian trading companies with grandfathered arrangements. These flows represented less than 5% of European consumption, but served as a critical marginal supply during peak demand periods. Force majeure, the legal doctrine that excuses contract performance when extraordinary circumstances make it impossible, requires demonstrating that the non-performance is beyond the declaring party's control. Gazprom's declaration cited 3 factors: sanctions-related inability to service compressor equipment, banking restrictions preventing payment processing, and insurance unavailability for pipeline operations. Each factor was created by Western sanctions. The declaration effectively argues that Europe's own policies have made delivery impossible, a legal framing that shifts liability from Russia to the sanctioning parties and potentially voids contractual penalties that would otherwise apply. The European Commission's initial response, issued 12 hours after the declaration, disputed the force majeure characterization and asserted that contractual obligations remain in force regardless of self-serving legal interpretations. The statement did not explain how gas would flow when the entity controlling the infrastructure has declared it won't pump. Legal disputes take months to resolve. Gas storage depletes in days. The timeline mismatch means that whatever the courts eventually decide, the physical reality will have already determined the outcome. At 3:30 a.m. Vienna time on January 24th, Austria's OMV, one of the buyers affected by the force majeure, confirmed that Turkstream flows had ceased and that alternative supply arrangements are being urgently pursued. The confirmation acknowledged what the Commission's statement had obscured. The gas has stopped, regardless of the legal characterization. When institutions do this, they're not managing risk, they're containing disaster. The emergency response options available to European policymakers are constrained by infrastructure that cannot be reconfigured on emergency timelines. Option 1. Increase LNG imports. Europe's regasification capacity is approximately 220 billion cubic meters annually, theoretically sufficient to replace all Russian supply and then some. But capacity and utilization are different things. Global LNG supply is fully committed under long-term contracts, with spot availability limited to approximately 15 to 20 million tons per month. Europe is already receiving every available cargo. There is no additional LNG to import because there is no additional LNG. Option 2. Increase Norwegian supply. Norway's Equinor operates at 95 to 98% of maximum capacity during winter months, with production limited by reservoir pressure, pipeline capacity, and planned maintenance that cannot be indefinitely deferred. Norwegian flows could increase by perhaps 5 to 8% for brief periods, but sustained increases risk reservoir damage that would reduce long-term production capacity. Option 3. Demand rationing. European emergency protocols authorize mandatory curtailment of industrial gas consumption to preserve residential heating. Germany's Phase 3 protocol, Austria's Energy Emergency Powers Act, and similar frameworks across the EU provide legal authority for forced industrial shutdowns. The authority exists. Exercising it means acknowledging that the market cannot balance supply and demand, an admission that would trigger financial market consequences beyond the energy sector. On January 23rd, Germany's Federal Network Agency notified the 47 largest industrial gas consumers that precautionary curtailment protocols should be reviewed and staff prepared for implementation. The notification was sent via secure channels and was not publicly announced. The companies notified include BASF, ThyssenKrupp, and multiple glass, ceramics, and chemicals manufacturers whose production processes cannot be safely interrupted without multi-day shutdown sequences. Less than 30 days remain before storage levels force the rationing decision, regardless of political preference. If temperatures remain below normal, which extended forecasts indicate they will through mid-February, the timeline compresses to 22 days. If any additional supply disruption occurs, Norwegian maintenance, LNG cargo diversions, technical failures, the timeline compresses further. The last time European governments implemented mandatory energy rationing was the 1973-74 oil crisis. The political leaders who authorized those measures faced electoral defeat within 2 years. The current political calculation is to delay the decision as long as possible, hoping that temperatures moderate or alternative supply materializes. Hope is not a strategy, but it's the only option that doesn't require admitting the situation is beyond control. While one side rations, the other side calculates. Russia's timing was precise. The force majeure declaration came during the coldest period, when storage was already depleting faster than normal, when spot LNG prices were at seasonal highs, and when European political attention was divided between energy crisis, Ukraine support debates, and approaching spring elections in multiple member states. The calculation is that maximum pain will produce maximum political division. Hungary's Viktor Orban has already called for immediate negotiations with all energy suppliers without ideological preconditions. Slovakia's government announced it would seek bilateral energy security arrangements outside EU frameworks. Italian industrial associations have demanded realistic assessment of sanctions costs before further support for Ukraine. The fragmentation is the point. A unified European response could potentially weather the crisis through coordinated rationing, shared reserves, and collective purchasing power. A fragmented response, with each nation prioritizing its own supply, creates a scramble that benefits whoever controls marginal supply. Russia controls marginal supply. The Turkstream flows that were terminated could resume within 24 hours if Gazprom's operational decisions changed. The infrastructure exists, only the decision to pump is absent. This creates a dynamic where any European nation willing to break from collective policy could potentially secure bilateral supply that neighbors cannot access. On January 21st, the day before the force majeure declaration, Gazprom CEO Alexei Miller gave an interview to Russian state television in which he noted that Russia has never used energy as a weapon, and that technical and commercial solutions exist for any customer genuinely seeking supply. The statement was simultaneously a denial of weaponization and an invitation to defection. The invitation is targeted at European leaders whose domestic political survival depends on keeping the heat on. The price of survival is abandoning collective policy. The alternative is explaining to frozen constituents why principles matter more than warmth. This is not energy policy. This is political warfare conducted through thermostats. The mathematics of the trap are now inescapable. European gas consumption during a cold winter runs approximately 1.5 billion cubic meters per day. Current supply from non-Russian sources, Norway, Algeria, Azerbaijan, LNG, totals approximately 1.2 billion cubic meters per day. The gap is 300 million cubic meters daily, previously filled by storage withdrawals and residual Russian flows. Storage contains approximately 47 billion cubic meters of working gas at current levels. At a 300 million cubic meter daily deficit, storage depletes to critical levels in 156 days, seemingly adequate. But the deficit is not linear. Cold snaps increase demand by 30%, raising the daily gap to 450 million cubic meters. At that rate, storage depletes to critical levels in 104 days. Current cold conditions have persisted for 14 days and are forecast to continue for at least 14 more. 28 days of elevated withdrawal at 450 million cubic meters daily consumes 12.6 billion cubic meters, reducing storage from 47 billion to 34.4 billion. At that point, even a return to normal temperatures leaves inadequate buffer for the remainder of winter. The mathematics allow no margin for additional disruption. Any unplanned outage, a Norwegian pipeline issue, an LNG terminal problem, a transmission constraint, tips the balance from difficult to impossible. The system is operating without reserves, without flexibility, and without alternatives. On January 22nd, the ENTSO-G transmission system model showed 14 European nations in supply adequacy stress, meaning that projected demand exceeds projected supply under baseline assumptions. The model showed 6 nations in potential curtailment scenario, meaning that industrial rationing may be required even without further supply disruption. The model was shared with national regulators under confidentiality provisions that prohibit public disclosure. The numbers exist, the analysis exists, the conclusions exist. What doesn't exist is a solution that doesn't involve either freezing or conceding. This is what a system looks like when every path leads to unacceptable outcomes. The informed are not waiting for official announcements to understand what's happening. European natural gas futures for February delivery have risen 47% since January 8th, reaching 78 euros per megawatt hour, the highest level since the August 2022 crisis peak. The front-month premium over summer contracts has reached 34 euros, reflecting market expectation that winter stress will not ease quickly. Industrial gas allocation prices in Germany's secondary market have reached 95 euros per megawatt hour, as companies with contracted supply sell to companies facing curtailment at premiums that reflect desperation rather than value. The secondary market only exists when primary allocation fails to match supply with demand. Physical gold purchases at European dealers have spiked 180% in the past week, with the largest increases in Germany, Austria, and Poland, the nations most directly affected by storage depletion. The purchases are concentrated in small denominations, suitable for emergency transactions. Retail buyers are preparing for scenarios that official statements don't acknowledge. Credit default swap spreads on European utility debt have widened to crisis levels, with E.ON, ENGIE, and Eni showing spreads comparable to March 2022, the peak uncertainty period immediately after the invasion. The bond market is pricing in the possibility that utility balance sheets cannot survive another year of crisis. The euro-US dollar exchange rate has fallen 4.2% since January 8th, reflecting capital flight from European assets into dollar-denominated safe havens. Currency markets are pricing in economic damage that energy markets haven't yet fully reflected. Heating oil prices in Germany have risen 28% in 2 weeks, as households with oil backup systems attempt to reduce gas dependency. The surge indicates preparation for gas curtailment by those with alternatives, leaving those without alternatives more exposed to whatever rationing occurs. The question is not whether Europe faces an energy emergency. The question is, who understands that emergency well enough to act before acting becomes impossible? A thermostat on a wall in Warsaw, 21 degrees Celsius. The temperature that separates comfort from crisis, normalcy from emergency, political stability from political upheaval. 30 days of gas remain in storage at current withdrawal rates, 20 days if the cold persists, less if anything else goes wrong. This is not a policy problem. This is a physics problem. The collision between finite supply and non-negotiable demand, between infrastructure that was built for one world and a reality that belongs to another. Physics doesn't negotiate. Storage doesn't refill itself. And reality, eventually, asserts itself over every system that assumes supply would appear because demand existed. The divergence between what European leaders say and what European thermostats will show has never been more immediate. What happens next is not prediction. It's 47 billion cubic meters of gas, minus 300 million per day, until the number reaches zero. The countdown has already begun.